Okay, so now that we've actually fit our model using MCMC, how do we go about conducting posterior predictive model checking? Well, the first step in posterior predictive model checking is to simulate posterior predictive data sets. And to do that, for our single normal example, what we're going to do is randomly sample from among the parameter values we sampled during MCMC, so these red dots here. We're going to take a whole series of these red dots, so ideally we'd like to simulate at least 100 data sets. If it's not too computationally intensive, we'd like to simulate more than that. And here in gray, in these sort of grayish shadows, you can get a sense for what these simulated data sets look like. And so as you can see, these distributions, again, look quite different from the data we've observed in our population. But we'd like a quantitative way to compare them. We'd like a number that we can assign to each of these gray simulated data sets here and compare it to our empirical data set represented in the red and yellow. Now, one term that's important to know, this series of data sets here in gray, that's what's known as our posterior predictive distribution. So a posterior predictive distribution is actually a distribution on data sets. So this is the series of data sets that we've simulated. Those are an estimate of the posterior predictive distribution. Now the code to actually do this can be found in the PPS for posterior predictive simulation _ single normal.rev file. And so what we're going to do here, we're going to begin by reading in the values from our MCMC analysis. So we're going to read the log or the trace file that contains the parameter values we've sampled during MCMC. Now again, these are not data. These are, in terms of trait values, these are not trait values. These are values of the means and standard deviations based on the MCMC. But then next, we're going to read in our empirical data. So these are the actual trait values we've sampled from our population. So that's contained in data.txt. Now the next step here is really just technical. We have to convert the data that we've read in into a vector. So we do that using this syntax here. This isn't really important to the workflow overall, but it's just something we need to do to be able to calculate our values later on. And then the final step is the really important part, and this is where we actually do the simulation. So we're taking the parameter values that we read in up here from our log file, and we're actually simulating our posterior predictive data sets. And to do that, we're going to use a for loop. So we're actually going to begin simulating from the 50th sample from our MCMC. So we're using the first 49 samples as burn-in. We're discarding them as burn-in. So we're going to simulate starting from the 50th MCMC sample. And then we're going to store these in a vector called sims. So sims will store all of the simulated data sets. And so each entry in sim will be a simulated data set that's the same size as our empirical data set. And that's simulated using a mean sampled from our MCMC and the corresponding standard deviation sampled from our MCMC. So at the end here, we're going to have sims as a vector of vectors. So sims contains all of the posterior predictive data sets, and each entry in sims contains its own vector of simulated trait values.